minutes because we're just before the hour. Give people a few minutes to join. If you want, you can please introduce yourselves to each other in the chat. I think that's enabled. Not 100% sure. And we do plan on having some time for questions and answers at the end of the session. So if any questions come to you during the event, please write them down in the Q&A function, which you'll be able to find on the bottom, at the bottom of the screen. Or if you can't manage to do that, also feel free to write them in the chat, and I'll do my best to pick them up and pose them to participants towards the end. Just hi again to anyone who's coming in now. This is the TUC Fringe event, Stopping a Trump Trade Deal, organised by War on Want in collaboration with some of our speakers here today. We're going to get started in just a minute. As I was saying, please feel free to introduce yourselves to each other in the chat, and please pose questions during the panelist presentations if anything comes to you during the event. So while we're waiting for more people to come in, already have a good number now already. I'll just explain to you a little bit about who we are and why we wanted to put on this event. So I'm a trade campaigner at War on Want. War on Want will be an organisation that's familiar to many of you, but to those of you who don't know us, we're a radical anti-poverty campaigning organisation, and we see free trade agreements as one of the main ways that big multinational corporations have increased their power at an exponential rate over the last 50 years or so. And we've been campaigning against controversial trade deals like TTIP and CETA. And we're organising this today because one of the trade deals that's causing us a lot of concern at the moment, as the UK is leaving the EU and the government sees itself as wanting to establish itself as a so-called global Britain, unshackled from the reins of the EU and to free to strike trade deals with whomever they wish. We're concerned about this because we see this as an attempt for big business to do lots of the things that they wanted to do with TTIP. There's been a lot of stuff in the news over the last year about the threats to the NHS and to food standards. I'm sure everyone's heard of chlorinated chicken. These things have dominated the debate about the deal. And these threats alone should be enough to stop this deal, but unfortunately the threats to our communities, our jobs, our lives, to global justice, to climate justice, really don't stop there. Things like lower food standards, weakened chemical regulations, increased medicine prices, and ruling out any meaningful commitment to climate justice is what's at stake. These negotiations have been going on in secret, and we only know what we know now because of leaked documents about the content of the negotiations that came out last year. More worryingly, this and other neoliberal trade deals are being pushed through Parliament as the voices of trade unions, public interest groups and civil society organisations are being kicked out of advisory groups on trade, and the government is bringing in people like Tony Abbott to advise. We also have the trade bill going through the House of Lords at the moment, which threatens to take away any of the, threatens to bring us into a situation where people have no recourse to the normal functions of Parliament in a democratic society to have a say over what's in our trade deals. In order to learn a bit more about why this is the case, why we're all concerned about the US trade deal, and hear more about how we can stop it, I want to introduce a panel of experts from both sides of the Atlantic. We're going to be hearing first of all from Jean Blaylock, who is a campaigns and policy manager at organisation Global Justice Now. We'll be hearing from Arthur Stamoulis, who is the Executive Director of Citizens Trade Campaign, a national coalition of labour, environmental, family, farm, consumer and human rights organisations working together to improve US trade policy. And finally, from Rosa Crawford, a policy officer at the Rights International Social Economics Department, who will be sharing what the deal means for workers in the UK and what the trade union movement has been doing on this deal. So with that said, I am not going to take up too much time because we only have an hour, and I'm going to hand over to Jean to kick us off about what this deal means for food, climate, and others. Thanks, Jean.
Thanks, Leah. And yes, just my name's Jean Blaylock. I work for an organisation called Global Justice Now, which is a social justice campaigning organisation working as part of a global movement to challenge the powerful and try and create a more just and equal world. And I will, in my 8 minutes, try and talk about a couple of the particular issues that are of concern around this deal. One around food standards, animal welfare, one around climate, and then a little bit about the campaigning that we are doing and what we can do about it, how we can take action. But before that, I just did want to sort of start off, just take a slight step back about why are we campaigning around trade deals like this one. And it's important to make the distinction around we're campaigning about trade deals, not against trade itself. Trade deals over the past couple of decades have become quite detached from what you would normally think of as trade itself in many ways, rather than being, as maybe they were back in the 60s and 70s, literally deals about sort of tariffs on boxes of goods crossing borders, etc. They've become quite a powerful enforcement mechanism for a particular extreme market-oriented view of economy and society. It's because they've been given a lot of power in international law trade deals. They can overrule other types of treaties and deals and laws. And that has made them, together with the fact that they are conducted very secretively, a very useful tool. If you have quite a controversial issue around privatization, around standards, around things that affect people's lives, and if you introduce it directly into domestic legislation, you know it will be controversial, and there will be resistance, and there will be fights in Parliament, and there may be protests and whatever. But if you just slide it into these trade negotiations that are being negotiated somewhere that maybe people are not even aware of, with lots of acronyms, lots of jargon, it sounds very technical, very remote, and nobody's really paying that much attention. And then later you just come back and you say, oh, I'm so sorry, these things that you were talking around, you know, building a more sustainable food system, or tackling climate change, or building a better health service, they're very interesting, but unfortunately they're against the trade rules. Sorry, you know, there's just nothing we can do. The trade rules just say this, and this, you know, this happens all of the time, and this is why we need to stop seeing the trade deals as remote things and actually start engaging with them when they are happening, and try and challenge that idea that trade rules just set the rules for everything else. Now, this particular deal, the US-UK deal, this is a point where if we were meeting in person, I would probably sort of ask people to put their hand up if if you remember TTIP, if you were perhaps involved in campaigning against TTIP. As I can't see any of you, okay, I can see some hands going up. Thank you, guys. So that's great to know. So, I mean, our fear about a US-UK trade deal is that it will kind of be like TTIP on steroids. It will be much like TTIP with all the brakes taken off. And therefore, much of what I may then say may be quite familiar to you. But that's part of this pattern of trade deals being used over and over again to try and do the same kind of thing. So for those who do not know, TTIP was the proposed trade deal between the EU and the US, which was negotiated over about 7 years, but eventually failed because it was so controversial and because people rose up in protest. So we do know that we can take action against deals like this, and we can stop them. Okay, so what do we know about it? Well, as Leah said, the notes from 6 rounds of talks on this deal were leaked in November last year. So we do actually know quite a lot about what's in it. And one of the things that people have been worried about, and those notes confirmed it, is around food standards. And here is the iconic issue of chlorine chicken. And whenever I'm speaking about this, people will always say to me, but can we not move on from chlorine chicken? And I say, believe me, I would love to maybe sometimes be able to talk without speaking about chlorine chicken. But unfortunately, or possibly fortunately, it keeps coming back because it does symbolize a lot of what is at concern. So chlorine chicken, first, just quickly to say, it's not about the chlorine. It's about chlorine being used in a process to mask dirty conditions and dirty working conditions and poor animal welfare conditions for poultry, for chickens throughout the process. So our standards at the moment have a requirement, from farm to fork requirement, to try and keep things clean at all stages throughout the protest, which is better for the birds, it's better for the workers working with the birds. It's maybe not ideal, but it's an attempt. The approach that is used in the US, however, does not have the same animal welfare standards, and instead you can just sort of blitz everything at the end with a chlorine or other substance similar to chlorine wash. And to do this, of course, is cheaper. And there is therefore pressure to be able there's a pressure from the American poultry manufacturers to be able to sell their poultry in our markets, and concern from farmers to hear that if we accept those imports, that will undercut them because it's a cheaper approach to production. So this is one simple way in which trade deals can affect standards, because if it did start being sold here, farmers for a while might try and just compete on selling it on the grounds of being British chicken or whatever, but eventually you will start getting pressure from farmers here going, I want a level playing field, a different type of level playing field. I want to be able to compete with the US farmers with the same way, so I want to be able to take the same approach to standards. And you would get this downward pressure from within the country, which you could argue, people would argue, oh, that's different, that's something that happened later, but it would come as a result of the trade deal. So that's one way in which there would be a downward pressure on standards. But as I see people saying in the chat, this isn't just it isn't just chlorine chicken. It's a whole range of other issues: hormone-treated beef, ractopamine, which is steroids in pork, different levels of tolerance for things like maggots or hair in food, or pus in milk, and of course for GM. And it's not so much around sort of just importing one particular product or a few products. It's around importing an entire regulatory approach. And the US regulatory approach is much more, our standards are much more that you have to prove that something is safe before it can be put on the market. And the US approach is more, it can be put on the market until consumers or regulators prove that it is dangerous. And that difference in risk underlies a very profound difference in the standards that we have ended up with. I realize I am probably already going over my time, so I will not go into that in much more detail, but this is, the US uses words like science-based, which sounds wonderful. Why would you not want to be science-based? But they use it in a particular way, meaning if you have not got something specifically to prove that it is dangerous and it causes cancer, or it causes it affects brain developments in children, or something like this, and that's been definitively shown over sort of a long period, then they will not consider it to be science-based. Whereas the EU approach is much more precautionary based, And if, as I say, if you can't prove it to be safe, and as soon as risks start being talked about, it's like, well, maybe let's take it off the market until we've done those 20 years of studies and have worked out exactly what the effect is. And that's a thing that will affect, as I was saying, quite a wide range of standards. To talk also a little bit about, from a completely different angle, the climate angle, but also partly around standards. So trade deals, as I said, they can overrule other areas of public policy and other areas of international law, just because they've been given teeth. They've been given more enforcement and sanctions. So there's nothing that specifically says a trade deal comes above another area of international law. It's just that if you break the rules of the trade deal, there are usually consequences. Whereas if you break the rules of the climate treaty, not so much. And this means that if you could talk about, well, we are talking about in climate, we know we need binding regulation around climate. We need urgent action. We have lost so much time with policy approaches that just sort of say, I'm sure we can find a sort of a win-win approach here, where we can rely on corporations to do the right thing. We can encourage them through voluntary steps to take action. And we've lost 15, 20 years to this approach. We know we need a step change. We need to just move to a binding approach. And this is exactly where, again, the trade deal can be used to come in and say, unfortunately, in the trade deals, it says you must always prefer the least burdensome necessary approach to business. Thank you, Leah. And the least burdensome necessary approach to regulation is always voluntary self-regulation. So you will get climate proposals, and then you will get people saying, that's very interesting, but it might be against trade rules, so maybe we should just do it through a voluntary approach, which could be really dangerous at this point when we know we urgently need to take action on climate. There's also, I mean, the trade deal in itself can encourage more trade in dirty fossil fuels at a time when we should be keeping them in the ground. And also, you know, the climate costs of trade itself, of shipping. You know, when there are some things we need to trade, but there are some things where we trade, you know, we trade the same things from one side of the Atlantic to the other, and I'm never entirely sure why. But anyway, those are a couple of issues of concerns. I know Arthur and Rosa will touch on others. Just quickly, in probably my 20 seconds remaining, to say there is a movement growing against this. I mean, food standards and healthcare, I haven't talked about health because I think Rosa's going to talk about it, have become really political and really powerful issues. The government has been backed into a corner on these issues. Whenever they think people are looking away, they try and back down again, so we can't let up the pressure. But it is possible to get the government to back down. What we need to ensure is that people understand that there's a systemic problem with a trade deal like this. It's not just a couple of iconic issues. It's not just chlorine chicken and the NHS. It's chlorine chicken and the NHS and the climate and digital and workers' rights and a whole range of other things. And we really need to keep challenging that. And we are gearing up towards a day of action at the end of October, 24th of October. So if you are interested in taking action, I don't know, Leah, did we have a link to, there's a document for sort of organising locally. So I won't say more, take up more time, but if we maybe put that link in about ideas for taking action, and keep your eyes open for more information about the day of action. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jean. That's fantastic. The overview, the scale of the things that we need to do if our trading regime is to bring about an equal and climate just world are obviously enormous. But this deal is really important because this is something we can start with now. We might be able to win if we keep up the pressure. One of the things we wanted to emphasize in this was that when the UK does a trade deal with another country, it's not as if that other country or the citizens of that country automatically benefit in some profound way. These deals are a win for corporations. And that's why I'm really pleased that I'm able to bring in Arthur, who is the director of Citizens Trade Campaign, to talk about why activists in the US are against this deal and what the deals like this mean for workers in the US and globally. So please take it away, Arthur.
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. Again, my name is Arthur Stamoulis. I am the Executive Director of Citizens Trade Campaign, which is the US-based coalition of labor, environmental, family farm, faith, consumer organization that works together on trade policy. And I just want to give sort of a snapshot of this proposed trade agreement from the US, probably particularly from a labor perspective. And I guess the thing I should say from the start, you know, the main entry point for most American workers and US labor groups generally into trade policy is the global race to the bottom in wages and working conditions. In the US, we've experienced millions of good paying jobs shipped around the globe to wherever workers are the most exploited, environmental regulations are the weakest. This has had devastating impacts, not just on the millions of families directly affected, but on entire communities and regions here. And so when new trade agreements are proposed, the go-to question in labor is typically, you know, how is this going to contribute to offshoring and wages? And job offshoring is obviously not a top concern around a proposed US-UK trade agreement. We're not expecting people's livelihoods to move from the US to Britain to take advantage of sweatshop working conditions or lax environmental rules. And truthfully, you know, that has made and will continue to make mass mobilization against this pact in the US difficult. At the same time, we are at a moment in the United States when, due to shortages of personal protective equipment and other materials during the COVID crisis, and also as the US is wrestling with its place in the world, you know, in the face of Chinese growth and other issues, we are at this point when more people here are questioning global supply chains than ever before, when more people are questioning the justifications for neoliberal trade agreements than ever before. For the first time in my lifetime, we're at a point where polite society is talking about industrial policy in the US for the first time ever. And so, you know, at this moment, when new models for trade are becoming, you know, probably politically feasible here, at least politically imaginable inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C. And also at this moment when new models of trade are becoming, you know, clearly very necessary in the life and death terms of pandemics and climate disruption. You know, of course, at this moment, corporations are attempting to double down on their broken trade model that restricts public procurement preferences, that restricts public investment in strategic industries, that encourages the privatization of public services, that makes public interest regulation much more difficult, both through back-end attacks on regulatory decisions via dispute resolution processes, but also now via front-end attacks on so-called good regulatory practice requirements. You know, and we all know for over a quarter century now, as Jean said, corporations have been using free trade agreements as a backdoor means of sneaking deregulatory measures through countries' legislative bodies that could never be approved as standalone policies. You know, we've heard already and will continue to hear in this hour that that's really what the policy established by a US-UK pact is all about. And that's the absolute wrong policy for this moment. I mean, it's always been wrong, but it is especially outrageous today. And, you know, let me just sort of put a finer point on it and say how threatening it is that just at this moment when there is finally attention to industrial policy as a tool for rebuilding manufacturing capacity, that corporate lobby groups are now pushing new frontiers in trade policy that are going to have major effects on the next generation of service-oriented professions. One of the top issues for corporate advocates of the US-UK trade deal here is the digital trade chapter. This is a chapter that, you know, is not being pushed by mom and pop businesses that are looking to, you know, access more customers for their wares through the internet. That's how it's often sold. But instead, this is being pushed by some of the largest corporations on the planet: Amazon, Google, Facebook, and so on. And, you know, these corporations want the freedom to transfer people's data around the globe, free from regulation, free from taxation, free from any sorts of localization requirements whatsoever. And if they get their way, this is going to have profound implications, not just on consumer privacy and questions of corporate liability for data breaches and things like that. It's also going to have profound implications on where the jobs of the future are located and how the jobs of the future are structured. The companies pushing these digital trade provisions, have really been pioneers in using low-paid contract labor in order to evade local labor laws, make unionization much more difficult, basically maintain the flexibility to hire and fire workers pretty much on demand, not just year to year, month to month, but hour to hour, really. If there's work at this exact moment, we expect you to do that work. If there's not that much work at this exact second, you're not getting paid, right? And so these digital trade chapters are about handcuffing government policy space to try to rein in some of the precarious nature of work these days. And looking ahead, as 5G networks further develop, as self-driving cars and trucks and drones become more of a reality, as online schooling and online health consultations become more of a reality in the aftermath of the current health crisis, as future weather-related crises become more intense, basically as more and more of our economy goes online, the ability to bounce data around the globe free from regulation is also going to affect where these precarious workers are located. In the United States, we've seen what happens to manufacturing jobs when corporations are freed from regulation and taxation across borders. The jobs go wherever it's cheapest. And so big tech is looking, 10 or 20 years ahead as to how they can do the same thing to service sector jobs in logistics and transportation and retail and healthcare, education, and more. And so this digital trade chapter is something that worker advocates really need to be looking at very, very closely. And let me just sort of conclude on commenting on where this deal is headed in the United States. A lot here is obviously hinging on the outcome of November's presidential election. But I would caution people against placing too much hope in the election in terms of this trade agreement. A lot of other areas, a lot of reasons for hope about the election. The trade agreement, maybe not as much. If Trump is reelected, he's obviously going to keep pushing forward with this thing. I think our only hope on the U.S. side of stopping a bad U.S.-UK trade agreement at this point will be building a majority of opposition in the U.S. House of Representatives. And to be honest, we're not anywhere near ready to do that yet, at least not on labor concerns or consumer concerns. Maybe we could do so on concerns around Brexit in Northern Ireland. That is an issue close to the House Speaker's heart here. But crossing our fingers for an awful Brexit deal that sparks violence in Ireland is not really a strategy that we want to be pursuing. If Joe Biden is elected this November, he has proposed a temporary moratorium on new trade deals that hopefully would buy us a little time. But frankly, a trade deal with the UK would probably be seen as like one of the least controversial trade options on the table for his administration. So we should not be surprised if this is one of the trade negotiations that a Biden administration would relaunch first. And so, we need to continue trying to educate partners on the dangers of this pact, even if the path forward for the pact isn't entirely clear yet. And towards that end, leadership from British unions on the dangers of this agreement and clarity about what working people in the UK will and will not accept in trade policy, I think would certainly help US labor unions clarify their approach. So, I think I'll pause here. But just want to thank you again for having me, and I'm happy to answer questions when we get to that point.
Thank you very much, Arthur. It's really, really great to have you here, and loads of really, really important points there. And thanks also, you've answered one of the questions that was in the chat already, so that enables us to have a bit more time later. So I'm going to move now to Rosa, who speaks to us from the TUC, and to talk a little bit about what the deal means for public services in the UK and for workers here. Thanks, Rosa.
Thanks, Leah, and hi, everybody. I'm Rosa Crawford from the Trade Union Congress, as Leah said, and I lead on international trade policy. And it's great to be with you at the Fringe event at the Trade Union Congress's annual Congress event here. And some of you have probably been following the debates that happened this morning online. Do tune in on the TUC's website tomorrow morning, where you can see the debates pick up again. And tomorrow, particularly relevant to this discussion, there will be debates on our motions on trade and on the global response to the pandemic that we need to build. And there'll also be 2 general council statements on that. And I refer you to those because that really sets out, and I'll put the links in the chat, that really sets out the principles of the UK union movement, that trade agreements must benefit workers' rights and must benefit the broader society at large if they are going to have the support of working people. And in that means we need to have protections for public services, we need to have assurance of good jobs, we need to have protections for data security, as Jean and Arthur have already touched on. And our statements also emphasise the importance of getting a good deal with the EU in order to safeguard those principles, in order to assure protections for workers' rights and good jobs. And we're clearly meeting at a time when the UK and EU talks hang in the balance, as many of you will be aware. And the TUC has condemned, I think this will come out more in the Congress debate as well, the condemnation, suggestion that the government will break with international law with this internal market bill by undermining the withdrawal agreement, and that in turn undermines the prospect of a good deal with the EU. So it's a very worrying time for workers in the UK, and with the threats of a no deal with the EU, it increases the chances we get locked into a bad deal with the US. So what I wanted to focus my interventions on are the principal concerns for the union movement around a US deal, particularly around workers' rights, threats to good jobs and threats to public services. But I also will touch on some of our campaigning with our US counterpart, the AFL-CIO, to pick up on the points that Arthur was raising earlier. And I'd be interested also in the discussion about where we can link up with some of the groups on this call as well in terms of our advocacy. But to focus first on threats to workers' rights, and this is really where you can see the counterpoint starkly between what the EU has proposed in its draft agreement to the UK and what is threatened by the outlined approach of US and UK negotiators. Because whilst the EU draft agreement gives us a guarantee that workers' rights will stay at a high level and there will be an enforcement mechanism to assure that, in the US and UK negotiations, it's clear the mandate has set out that the deal wants to lower not only tariffs on goods, but non-tariff barriers, which are trade speak for any kind of regulation or protection that businesses regard as unfair discrimination against their ability to make profit in a market. As Jean and Arthur have picked up, it's clear that this is a corporate agenda that's being pursued through trade agreements. And the fact that that is clear and it's open in the negotiating mandates of both the UK and the US makes it clear that rights and regulations that protect workers' safety and conditions of work, things like guaranteeing that workers don't need to work excessive hours, don't go into unsafe workplaces, all of those could potentially be pressured to be lowered by US corporations and the US government working on their behalf. Now, many of you are probably aware, and Arthur can tell us a lot more in detail, but certainly the situation for workers' rights in the US is lower significantly than in the UK, where there's only ratification of 2 out of the 8 ILO core conventions, no right to sick pay and maternity pay or holiday pay at the federal level. And Arthur will tell us more, I'm sure, about the right to work laws, which restrict trade union organisations severely to the extent where freedom of association is not really possible. So the fact there's a much lower level of workers' rights found in the US means that there will be pressure from the US side to bring down the UK to the same standard in order to enable their businesses to profit by a deal. And that is seen as a key prize, bringing down those regulatory standards. Now, the lower rights found in the US also brings us on to threats to jobs, because if businesses want to increase their ability to make profit in the UK, the kind of jobs they're creating are not going to be jobs where workers are treated incredibly, paid very generously, and given very decent working hours and decent conditions. They're likely to be more of the kind of poor jobs, some of the kind of precarious work that we've seen explode in recent years, and we've expressed extreme concern about. It's likely that that's going to be the kind of jobs that would come from a US deal, and we see significant threats of that, even in the scoping document from the UK government, where it talks about manufacturing job losses being projected from a deal with the US. And people might know that manufacturing in the UK is one of the most unionized sectors, similar to the US, in fact, that we have here, and the fact that those jobs are already being projected to be lost by a US deal suggests that it's good jobs that will go and be replaced by poor quality employment. And obviously, when we talk about employment and damaging impacts, clearly not getting a deal with the EU will cause potentially millions of job losses. And obviously that will be compounded by the job losses projected by the impact of the pandemic. And the UK government's projections make clear that a US trade deal is only projected to increase GDP by 0.16%, whereas not having a good trade deal with the EU could make it fall by 4.9%. And this was even before you factored in COVID impacts. So it's clear that the job losses that will be created by no deal and pandemic are far outweighing any gains we could get from the US. We've seen also threats to jobs by the approach towards tariffs taken by the US, where we already have tariffs on steel, aluminium, Scotch whisky. Likely that more tariffs may be threatened to be imposed through the process of negotiations, which will also have a significant impact on jobs. And again, it's workers' livelihoods that are paying the price in this politically motivated negotiation. So moving on to threats to public services, which is one of the most important threats for our membership, and significant numbers of our members work in public services, but obviously all users of them. And this is quite clear in the UK government objectives that there will be threats, because there's no exemption outlined at a general level in those negotiating objectives for public services, which means, without going into the detail, we can if people want in the questions, but it means that public services that have already been privatised are highly likely to be included, at least partially, if not a very significant number, in a trade deal with the US. And that means that they would be locked into commitments to stay open. So if a future UK government wanted to renationalise those public services that were included, then they would face potential challenge by the US government. Or if there was this investor-state dispute settlement clause in the agreement, which allows corporations to challenge governments for actions that breach their ability to make profit, a corporation like a US drugs pharmaceutical company could sue the UK government for renationalising services, or in any other way regulating a service. So, for example, and we've heard quite a lot about this in the debate already in the past few months, if the UK continues to have its affordable healthcare provisions and provisions that make sure that medication is provided in a way that provides value to the public purse, that could be challenged by a US pharmaceutical company in the future, because that restricts their ability to make profit. So clearly the threats are there, despite the UK government saying, oh, the NHS isn't on the table, but it's actually quite clear that it will be included from the terms of it. So having outlined the principal threats, I kind of wanted to move on to what we've been doing about it. And some of our General Council statement that will be discussed tomorrow will make clear that we are an internationalist movement, and our bonds with trade unions from other countries is one of our key ways of having strength and influence beyond this country, where I think it's fair to say we have a government that's been pretty intransigent when it comes to listening to trade unions' concerns around trade and its trade negotiations. And people may have seen that in March, the UK and US trade union movements joined together to release a joint statement. So TUC and the AFL-CIO, which is our counterpart in the US, released a joint statement, made it clear that workers in the UK and US, have the same principles when it comes to trade, which I think is very important. Arthur can, I'm sure, say more about this, with Trump constantly courting the workers' vote when it comes to his trade policy and saying this is all about protecting US jobs. But the AFL-CIO has said they would only accept a trade deal that has binding protections for workers' rights, a high standard of rights being guaranteed, protections for public services, data protection, all the kind of things that we know a Trump administration would oppose, and potentially also a neoliberal Biden administration. So it makes it clear that we're absolutely on the same page when it comes to principles, and the joint statement makes clear that the priority to protect workers' rights and jobs in the UK must be a good EU deal that locks in those high standards. And it's good for workers everywhere if we could get a good deal with the EU that locks in those high standards, because it makes it harder for companies to use these trade agreements to go to the places where it's easiest to exploit workers, and starts to build in the kind of enforcement mechanism Jean was talking about, which we would thoroughly support, where there's enforcement that's binding around human rights, labour rights, as well as environmental protections. And we have a number of other joint statements that we've been agreeing with countries that we're also doing other trade negotiations with, like Japan, Australia, New Zealand. And I think that global labour movement advocacy is really important for putting pressure on governments, and it's all the same demands coming from all over the world. So I think that's really important. And just to kind of, because I have very little time left, just to highlight also that US trade unions have access to the text of trade negotiations. And that's something that, as Leah highlighted at the start, UK unions do not have, neither the civil society groups. And we've been working with a number of you, as well as with a number of opposition MPs in Parliament, to highlight that and say, actually, it's common practice, even in the US, where, as we've highlighted, they don't have the same levels of worker protection, but there is even that consultation going on in the US. That's been important for us, not that they can share the text with us, but they can certainly tip us off in terms of the outlines of the negotiations, and for us to say, actually, this should be standard practice, because until you have that union voice in the trade negotiations, you are not going to have those protections for workers' rights or public services or good jobs that you need. So just in concluding, I want to share the kind of feeling that there has been progress made by Arthur and Jean. I think we have pushed the negotiators onto the back foot. The UK government was talking about a quick deal before the US elections in November, only a few months ago, and now, partly because of that pressure, the outrage over tariffs, the outrage over agricultural standards potentially being reduced, and potentially Trump's chance is not looking as great, but I don't think we can be too hopeful potentially. But I think that public pressure has really helped to push these talks further in the long run, and they won't be concluded quickly. So I think building on that pressure is really important. We have the trade bill in Parliament now, and I know a number of us are lobbying on that. TUC is doing active lobbying. And I think thinking about more joined up lobbying we could do on that is really important. And like I said, bringing in the international union networks that we can bring to bear. So I'll conclude with that. And I look forward to our discussion and thinking about how we can join up our groups in further advocacy. Thanks.
Thanks, Rosa. That was fantastic. Both a scary presentation in terms of what this deal might mean, but also some notes of optimism about what's been going forward. It's from what I've heard today, and obviously I know more about this subject, so I know that there are even scarier things that we haven't heard about, such as the radical difference between standards on chemicals in the US versus in the UK at the moment. The US has banned 11 chemicals, whereas under EU regulations, there are currently 1,300 banned in the UK. This deal is massively unpopular. 82% of people don't want to reduce our food standards through a trade deal with the US. So it is shocking that the government is pursuing this negotiation as far as it has. With that, I want to turn to some of the questions. We have about 15 minutes left before I'll come back to the panelists for a final roundup. So if anyone has additional questions, please get them in as soon as possible so I'm able to include them. I'll just read out the ones from the Q&A first. How would a proposed UK-US trade deal affect arts, culture, media, and the entertainment sector? Where could unions like Equity, which represents many of these workers, contribute to this debate or stand in solidarity with this campaign? I'll read it out 3 or 4 and then allow people to pick up on which ones they think might be more relevant for them to speak to. What is the present state of play with lack of taxation and tax havens, which are now the way international capitalism holds down costs and extracts profit for the benefit of the few shareholders? That's a question from Richard. I don't know if anyone wants to come in on the digital services tax in that question as well. Could you say something about the timescale for the deal and how the US election will affect it? I know that Arthur came in on a bit on that, but Jean, if you have any additional comments, happy to hear those too. Does anyone want to come in on those questions straight off the bat before I come with the second round?
I can come in on just on the arts, the culture, potential threats.
Please, yeah. Yeah, we know that the BBC is also possibly under threat from this trade deal.
Yeah, absolutely, and they're very welcome to comrades from Equity. TUC has produced a briefing on UK-US negotiations that I'll share in the chat as well, which outlines some of these threats. But there have been particular threats highlighted to us from the culture sector unions around copyright rules being potentially reduced by US negotiators pushing for increased power for platforms like YouTube to share uncopyrighted content and not be prosecuted for it, which clearly puts the artistic protections of culture workers under threat. And then there are, as Leah says, the cultural industries that are supported by government. I mean, in the UK, it hasn't been as much as in other EU countries, where countries such as France in particular have always argued for this cultural exception, whereby their cultural sector is never included in any trade agreements. And they were arguing for this fairly successfully with TTIP as well, to say that actually the strict quotas and regulations that the French government applies on their cultural sector should not be touched by a trade agreement. Now, obviously, the UK government hasn't gone that far ever. But I think that that's something that I think we need to bear in mind when we talk about the kind of public services that could also be potentially challenged. We would include potentially something like the BBC and the way it's regulated. So I think that those are important threats to highlight. And I'll share the briefing, which has a bit more detail about that in it.
Thanks very much. Jean, did you want to come in on any there?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, to supplement what Arthur was saying, I mean, I think the simple thing to remember is that TTIP was an Obama-era deal. Biden is quite likely to take a very similar approach. So, yeah, as Arthur was saying, just to sort of spell it out like that, in terms of approach to trade deals. I mean, when I first looked at the first sort of trade policy statement coming out of the Trump administration, it was like, well, the language has got a lot more aggressive. The content on the whole is very similar, and I think that's one of the things that we are fighting against in the need to have an entirely different approach to trade. On tax, it's not so much my area, I won't say, but to maybe just mention the digital services tax, which this is also, I suppose, elaborating on the area that Arthur was talking about around the digital chapter within the trade deal. So earlier this year, the UK introduced a digital services tax, which is a sort of a small transaction tax that applies to digital services served by the big digital giant companies like Amazon, Google, Facebook, many of whom are tax avoiders extraordinaire. It's one of their great skills, avoiding paying tax, and a digital services tax is one way that quite a lot of countries are looking at in order to see if that's something that could be done to try and force companies to pay tax. And we see the US deal being used in a couple of ways to try and get rid of that. So one is simply a lot of pressure from negotiators, also from Congress, saying this digital services tax is really making things quite difficult for a US trade deal. If you want a US trade deal, it would be a lot easier if you just got rid of your digital services tax. And for the US sort of also saying things like a digital services tax should only be being discussed in a multilateral context. And there is one place where this has been discussed within the OECD, but the US has just thrown a spanner in the works in those talks. So those talks are going nowhere, which is why countries like the UK and France have been doing just their own measures. And then we also see lobbying documents from the internet industry and their proposals amongst the various things that around that Arthur was talking about also say would try and outlaw the introduction of a digital services tax, write that into the US trade deal. And in general, I see our societies waking up at the moment to the challenges and the power faced by internet giants like those. And I think our societies are still working out exactly what to do about them. I mean, they're quite complex questions, some of these questions around, the best ways of handling hate speech and false political advertising and all of these sorts of things. But I think the thing that is very clear is that what we do not want is to have the trade rules just sort of say, you can't try and figure it out, you can't experiment, you can't try introducing provisions and work them out and refine them and see if they work. The trade rules are just going to specify from the start that you cannot regulate the internet giants. Anyway, sorry, yeah.
Thanks very much for that, Jean. And just to sort of emphasize a point that possibly sometimes this discussion about trade between the US and the UK misses out, but is that we don't want this deal, not only because it's an incredibly bad deal for our people, for our planet, but also it risks setting a precedent in terms of the trade deals that both of the countries have with other countries, particularly those in the global south. When you think about the discrepancy in the power imbalance, and the fact that when you look at an area like digital rights, like data, the two countries that we're speaking of are kind of ahead of the pack, I suppose, in terms of developing regulation on digital, in that they are leading the way for a deregulated, liberalized system whereby nations don't have control over the data that their citizens generate. Neither do the individuals have control over the information that they generate. 50% of countries in Africa don't have any laws at all on digital privacy to begin with, let alone any kind of legal infrastructure on data. So that's something we really need to be aware of. Also, when the UK is striking deals with countries like Japan. So after that interlude, sorry, I will go back to the questions, which I realize many of which are still open. And we just have about 10 minutes left. So Stephen asks, as is the case, trade deals have been negotiated in secret with no involvement of civic society and trade unions. Is there anything in law which says that the agreement is not lawful even if your parliament has passed it? Is it easier in this case for future government to cancel the trade deal saying it was negotiated in secret and not co-produced by all of our society? That would be a great idea. I'll leave anyone who wants to come in on the trade bill issue there to talk about that.
Shall I do that, Leah, or do you want to read it?
I'm looking through.
Well, I mean, no, that at the moment the UK's rules, the UK's rules on the passing of treaties have not effectively been updated since the 1920s. They were codified more recently than that, but in principle, they say that the executive, the government, can decide who to do a deal with, what the objectives of the deal are, do the negotiations, sign the trade deal, and doesn't have to tell anybody about it. It brings it to Parliament to be ratified, but the ratification is a rubber stamp. If nobody objects within 21 working days, then the deal is passed, and there is no mechanism to object. many civil society and also business organisations in the UK have been campaigning for the last 3 years to try and change this. There is still a chance. So the trade bill that is going through Parliament, the trade deal in the previous Parliament was amended in the Lords, and the government preferred to drop it than take it further. The trade bill this time around is getting to the Lords, and the same amendments are being pushed forward. So the pressure for the Lords to take action again. But then, you know, the challenge is really to, if we can pass something in the Lords, to keep that in the Commons, given the government's majority.
Could I just add to that? I mean, we're definitely pushing for those amendments in the trade bill as well, and that's really important for the union movement to actually have a democratic scrutiny of a process of trade agreements being made law, but also in terms of the consultation of trade unions and civil society groups, and that's certainly not something that we have at the moment. And just to say a little more about some of the structures that the government had established, which were moving in the right direction, and now we've seen the move in the backwards direction. We had a series of sectoral advisory groups that the Department of International Trade had established, some of which, because of union advocacy, like chemicals and life sciences and culture, in fact, included trade union representatives as well as employer representatives. But a few weeks ago, we heard the announcement that those sectoral groups were being disbanded and they were going to be replaced with business-only sectoral groups, which didn't include even business federations. So the Confederation of British Industry, the TUC's counterpart in business, wasn't included. It was only smaller businesses. I think this is part of the government's divide and rule strategy amongst employer groups and trying to bring the most supportive employers in, whereas everybody else was shut out. So we've been doing lots of campaigning, and that's been raised by a number of supportive MPs in the context of the trade bill, and concerns that shows that they really are not looking to engage civil society and trade unions. So I think that's a really important point, that we should keep pressing on the lack of engagement by unions and civil society and the lack of democratic scrutiny.
Thanks, Rosa. We just have a few minutes left, so I'm very sorry that we haven't managed to get to all of the questions. I see there was one question about what we could do and whether writing to our MPs will help, and I hope so. So I am putting a link in the chat to an action that Warren Want is organising. I want to come back to all panelists for one final quick round, what they would recommend that people who are concerned about this deal do now to try and stop it. And just, I'll go to Arthur first, because we haven't heard from you on the questions yet. If there's anything additionally you wanted to add as well. As quick as you can, 1 minute.
Yeah, 1 minute. So, you know, I mean, just to highlight, you know, the message I was trying to get across, in the US, I think it's going to be very difficult to build a lot of opposition to this agreement, just because it doesn't hit on the traditional areas where Americans have mobilized against free trade pacts in the past. That does not mean that this agreement isn't extremely harmful to working people in both countries. It just means that, you know, we're going to be counting on our British counterparts to do as much as possible to stop a bad agreement. So I would highly encourage people to get involved with the groups that the panelists represent. There's tons of excellent information out there being generated and ways for people to get engaged. And if you need to get engaged with us in the United States, citizenstrade.org.
Thank you. Jean?
Yeah, I mean, the ways to get organised, I mean, I think the links that we have shared, get active, talk to peers. So there's some questions in the chat about CLPs. One of the things in that link is there's a model motion that you might use at the CLP, and yeah, very happy to come and talk to groups like that, who union branches, CLPs, other local groups, to help raise awareness around this. I do just want to emphasize, in talking about the trade deal, the trade bill, and the lack of power of Parliament, we can still stop this deal without it. It is a corporate-driven deal, and if we can keep knocking out areas like knocking out the agri-food area, knock out the health food area, if we could then knock out the chemicals area, knock out fossil fuel, then it becomes less and less valuable to the corporate drivers behind the deal. I mean, it would be better if there was a vote in Parliament, but if we can degrade the deal, if we can knock enough holes in it, if we can throw enough sand into the works, we can still stop it without that. So I would want to emphasize that. We can stop this deal.
Thanks. Rosa, do you have a last word for us?
Yeah, so I mean, I think for all the union members, please get in touch with your local branch. Also at the national office, most trade unions have officers covering trade or international issues, and they'd be able to provide you with more information about what your union is doing. And on the TUC's website, you can find a number of resources, and I'd be happy to come and speak to union branches as well. I think it's really important in the union movement we do raise awareness amongst our members around why it's important for them to get involved and the threats to jobs and our conditions and pay and the public services that we work in and rely on, because I think the kind of technical speak that trade is so often presented in and trade negotiations are presented in stops people from feeling like they can get involved. I think it's really important that we do build this workers movement and raise awareness and raise consciousness. So please do use our resources for that. Please, if you need more information about contacting your MP, get in touch with me, because I think it's really important that over the trade bill, we use this momentum to actually put the pressure on. And as we've been saying, MPs have been raising these concerns, and this is one of the reasons why Liz Truss, our Trade Secretary, has had to step back from the US talks. Also the International Trade Select Committee, if you just go online and search International Trade Select Committee, it's a House of Commons Select Committee of a cross-party selection of MPs, and they have done a lot of work putting Liz Truss under pressure, scrutinising any prospect of talks, and that's also helped to put the government on the back foot. So I would endorse the hope that Jean and Arthur have given us, that there is a movement that is out there that can have a lot of pressure and can push back on this corporate agenda if we work together. So hopefully we can continue to be part of this discussion and this movement and actually see a workers' rights social trade agenda enshrined. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Thank you so much to all of the panelists. I think it's been a fantastic discussion. Someone's asking what's happening on October 24th. It's going to be a day of action. There's going to be online and offline events that we will be updating interested people about in the coming weeks. I want to say thank you to everyone who's come. We've heard that this is a deal that we might be able to defeat. We can defeat if we work together and we really pile on the pressure in the next couple of weeks and months. So thank you to everyone who's coming. Please take action. Please join, sign up, and share information about the US trade deal, and together we can stop it. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful rest of Fringe. Bye.